What's up, Audit fans? Dr. Amanda here with another video in our Standards Explained series, this time on ASA610 about using the work of internal auditors. Now, you're not seeing things. I am here in my pajamas. I've had a really long day and I wanted to make sure I got a video out this week. And I only realized that after I got into my PJs and I'm just too tired to actually get out and change. So let's jump into this video and I'll try and condense it a little bit because the standard is a little bit complicated, but let's get into it. Usually my Standards Explained videos are screencasts essentially of me going through the standards. However, this time when it comes to 610, there are some different rules. Now, we're talking about ASA610 about using the work of internal auditors. Now, normally our ISAs and ASAs are pretty closely aligned, but in this instance, there's quite a big gap. Because ISA 610 does allow the auditor to actually direct the work of internal auditors. So you can sort of bring internal auditors on to your external audit team. However, within the Australian situation, ASA 610, that is prohibited. So in this video, I'm going to talk about ASA 610, and in a coming video, I'll talk about the international variations. ASA 610 also does assume that the client has an internal audit function. Now, that internal audit function might be in-house, employees of the client who report directly to the audit committee conducting internal audit work. But it also is possible that the client has outsourced internal audit work to a professional audit firm. So when you look at it, the standard is really quite hard to read. There's lots of deleted paragraphs and things that don't make sense because the Australian modifications are in place. But you can check my video on the work of internal auditors so that you understand the difference between those. But there are really three main things to think about when it comes to internal auditors and using their work in Australia. The first thing that we have to do is determine whether the internal auditors are actually competent people. Then the second thing we need to think about is in what situations we might actually choose to use the internal auditors. And then the third thing to think about is how we're actually going to execute that process. So I'm going to talk about each of those three. Step one is making sure that you can rely on the work of the internal auditor. Remember that you are actually going to rely on this work to help you gain reasonable assurance, and you're putting your reputation and legal liability on the line here. So there are a couple of different things you need to think about. Number one, are there policies, procedures and structures in place to make sure that the internal auditor is objective? Making sure there's that reporting line up to the audit committee for internal audit reports is really, really important. Number two, do they have the correct skills, qualification and professional competence to do the work of an internal auditor? And then number three, are they following a systematic and professional approach to completing their internal audit work? Now, we know internal audits cover lots of different things. We're specifically looking at the financial reporting and work related to internal controls. Are they following audit programs? Do they have a specific program of what's being done throughout the year? Do they have policies, procedures, processes to set audit objectives, collect evidence, evaluate that evidence? So the first step is, do they have all those things? And if the internal auditor has all of those different characteristics, they have independence, they have the correct professional competence and skills, and they follow a systematic process to get the audit done, then we can move on to step two, which is, in which situations do we want to use the work of the internal auditor? So step two is deciding which part of the work that the internal auditors have done are we going to rely on. And this is pretty much open to anything, so you can use any of the internal auditor's work. Obviously, assuming they've met that prior criteria that we had in the first step, but there are certain areas where we need to steer clear. So those are areas where there's high amounts of auditor professional judgment, where there's more professional judgment, more of our work, and it's less formulaic or less mechanical, then we certainly want to do that work ourselves. The second area where we might want to steer clear of relying on the work of the internal auditor and use our own work more is where there's a higher risk of material misstatement, where there's a higher significant risk under ISA ASA610. We want to focus on those areas ourselves rather than relying on the work of others. We also want to make sure that we don't rely on the work of the internal auditor if for some reason that part of the internal auditor's work isn't subject to independence or a systematic approach, or they're less competent in that area. So the internal auditors might be really competent in something like bank reconciliations, but they might be less competent in another particular area, so we might not rely on their work. So essentially that's open to everything in the financial statements. Now, if I do decide to use the work of the internal audit function, there are a couple of things I need to do. Number one is I need to communicate with those charged with governance. I have to talk to the audit committee to make sure that they're aware that I'm relying on the work of the internal auditor. Then I have to figure out what is the match. Where are the parts of the internal audit and the external audit that line up where I might decide to rely on some internal audit information? Now, I can't just decide, hey, yep, these two areas are similar, we want to do similar tests, let's rely on their work. Instead, I need to evaluate, well, how did the internal auditors do their work? What were the conclusions that were made? What evidence did they collect? And if I do decide that they've used the correct audit objectives, they've designed correct procedures, they've collected the right evidence, I should inspect some of that evidence and inspect their audit documentation to make sure that the conclusions that they made were appropriate. Remember, we're taking a big risk when we rely on the work of the internal auditors because we're giving reasonable assurance, and therefore, when we do rely on that evidence, we need to evaluate it. We need to decide whether it's sufficient and appropriate under ISA ASA610 so that we feel comfortable in saying, yep, the internal auditors have done the work correctly. So if we are going to rely, we do need to actually check some of that work ourselves to make sure that it's been correctly performed. After we followed our 3 steps, remember, number 1, we check whether the internal audit team can be relied upon and they're following those procedures and they've got competence. Number 2, we determine which areas we think we're going to rely on the internal audit work for. Number 3, when we've chosen those areas where there is that match, then we look at the audit programs, the evidence and the conclusion, and potentially looking at direct evidence ourselves to make sure that we think it's sufficient and appropriate. After we've done all of that, we also need to make sure that we're documenting our professional judgments here. We're relying on work that may end up being faulty later on. We need to make sure we decide and we document why we've chosen to rely on the internal auditor's work, why we think they're competent, why we think there's low risk involved in doing this, so that in case there are problems in the future, we do get in and we've got some protection for ourselves. Remember, we also talk with those charged with governance, so we'll also talk about what we chat with the audit committee about, what areas of the audit we're relying on for work from internal audit, and what work that we're going to be doing ourselves. Now, I will be making a future video about the differences that come from ASA610 around direct assistance to auditors, so make sure that you're subscribed. Of course, if you thought the video was useful, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. And if you have a question about ISA ASA610, please make sure to drop that question in the comments and I'll do my best to give you a response. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy your evening. I'm off to now have a little bit of a relax before I head back to work tomorrow, but thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye.